All right, everybody, so this is going to be interesting because I'm losing my voice today. So we're going to see how far I can get through all this. I've been not talking all day so that I could basically get through this here. For all I know, in about 10 minutes, I'm going to start getting really quiet, but we'll do our best. Okay, anyway, so this is an opinionated vision for edX extensibility and customization. My name is David Joy. I work at edX2U. So let's go get into this, right? So the goals of this talk, which are also going to kind of serve as our agenda, we kind of want to answer this question, right? How do we extend the platform in a sustainable way? The ability to extend the platform, the OpenX platform is crucial to all of our success, and to our ability to actually work with it, right? Like as we, I think, heard earlier today, it's, the platform can't be all things to all people. We all, we need to be able to innovate with it and use it in unexpected ways. And so the mechanisms that we have built into the platform to allow us to do that are super important. And there's lots of them, and they have grown organically over the years, and we spent a lot of time thinking about them, but I haven't seen many efforts in kind of holistically looking at that and trying to understand, where are there gaps, where are there things that we should invest in. So this is basically how the talk is going to proceed, right? We're going to go through these 4 steps. One, we're going to define criteria by which we'll actually kind of evaluate all the extension mechanisms that exist. Second thing we're going to do is actually go through all the ones that I could think of, and others I asked around. Go through all of them and actually just do an audit of all of them, and kind of this is kind of where some of the opinionated stuff comes in, right? Like I'm going to rank all of the ways that we extend the platform based on my impressions of them, and I'm happy for those to be wrong, or to be amended as we go along. And then finally, given that, we're going to identify problem areas in areas that where we think there might be need for more investment, and then suggest some actions. I don't have GitHub issues linked or anything here, but I think maybe some roadmap items might come out of this. I can hope. Maybe that's vain. Who knows? So this comes with some caveats, right? Extensibility of this platform this is a huge topic, and it's incredibly complex, right? And I made an effort at breaking it down into understandable pieces and categorizing things and everything, but I know I didn't get everything right, and I know there's some things I probably missed, and I know when you look at some of these judgments I've made, we might disagree. That's perfectly fine, right? Like if I thought something was harder than it really is, cool, great. That means that it's actually the situation is better. If I thought it was easier than it really is, I'm very happy to be told I'm wrong. So we don't need to get hung up too much on the details here. I think of this a bit as a straw person, that we can use as a way of starting a conversation. I want to be able to look at the forest for the trees here and kind of think about this whole thing holistically. So just a slight aside for where I'm coming from. So that's me 4 years ago. I think I'm wearing a different shirt. Yeah, talking about front-end replatforming at the conference in 2019. So most of my history at edX was in kind of the micro front-end realm. A lot of that comes down to extensibility and customization, right? Like MFE's configurability, their internationalization, branding, theming, component customization, LTI. If we ever have plugins in MFEs, I spent a lot of time thinking about all that. And then more recently at 2U, my focus has been more on 2U's kind of, say, architectural relationship to the OpenX platform, how we use the technology, right? And as 2U tries to become, step back from edX's history as kind of the center of the universe, or whatever that it was, right? And that we try to become more equitable stewards of the platform, we care a lot about these mechanisms, right? Because we want to make sure that we're using them properly. That's the last thing I'll mention before we dive in, right? Is before this I did a survey because I thought it would be kind of silly to go and only have my opinion in a talk where I'm breaking down a bunch of things, some of which I don't know too much about, So I did a survey about 2 weeks ago, which had a list of all the different extension points, asked folks to kind of categorize them, whether they thought they were easy or hard, whether they thought they were common or uncommon, just to make sure that I had a bit of a sanity check on what I was saying here. And I got, I think, 17 respondents. We know that's probably not statistically significant, sure, but there's definitely some interesting insights in there, which we'll see here. Okay, so step 1, defining our evaluation criteria. So this is kind of think about this quote a lot, right? So this is something Stephen Birch said. Some of you probably know Stephen Birch. He was at Stanford for years, then he joined edX for a while. At the 2019 conference, we had, I think, the one and only meeting of what we call the Theming Advisory Group. And during that, he said this, right? So when you're talking about theming and extensibility and all that stuff, make the common stuff easy and make the uncommon stuff at least possible, is what he said. And that's always kind of stuck with me, right? Because if you're doing something that's very kind of rare, like, just make it possible. Like, if someone's trying to do something very unique, like, we can't really predict that. So they need to at least be able to get the work done. But if they're doing something common, like, if it's hard to do something that everybody has to do, that's obviously a problem for us. So we can take this quote and actually kind of break it down into 4 quadrants in a way, right? So things that are easy and common, great. That means we're probably doing a pretty good job there, right? Things that are very common but hard means that's an extension point that we probably should be investing more time in, right? Because it's something that people seem to need, but that we haven't made it easy for them. The right-hand quadrants are a little more interesting, right? Like, if something is rare and hard, maybe that's okay. That probably means that it's something that not many people need, and we don't want anything to be hard, but at the same time, we don't want to invest in stuff that's not going to have a lot of, ROI as well. I was talking about learners, but right? So things that are rare and hard, maybe so like it's kind of hard to say where those should be. And the last quadrant down here is kind of interesting, right? Something that is rare but easy may mean that we overinvested in it. We made something really great for something that not many people need. Or it might mean that we have something new that's really great that we just haven't promoted well. And I think we'll see some examples of that as we go along. My voice is holding up. This is not bad. Okay. All right. So another way of breaking this whole thing down, right? We're going to talk about all of our extension mechanisms into these 4 categories, right? Things that affect the back end, things that affect the front end, things that are kind of like content-based, maybe Xbox, and then things that I've called cross-service. And to me, this means, REST APIs, events, things that a service provides that allows us to make some other microservice that interacts with it. Just trying to teach the vernacular that I've gone with here, right? Another way of breaking these things down, all the different methods that we are using to extend the platform. We can talk about, kind of configuration-like things. We can talk about things that I've dubbed, interfaces, things that the system provides that you can hook into, kind of like we were just talking about with cross-service stuff. Plugins are kind of like an interface, but you're providing functionality to the system that it hadn't done before, and that modifies the way it works. And then overrides are basically the idea of just blowing away what the platform does and replacing it with something completely different. And so these first 2, effectively are using existing behavior. They're not modifying the way, they're extending it. They're not modifying the way that existing behavior of the platform works. Oops, just pushed the wrong direction. These 2, plugins and overrides, are actually there to, in this parlance, are there to actually, modify the existing behavior of the system. And you can imagine that, just configuring or just using a REST API is a pretty uninvasive thing. You're not like really messing with anything. Whereas providing a plugin that changes existing behavior, or just comprehensive theming, blowing away like an entire set of files and replacing with your version, that's pretty invasive. And so a thing that can happen here is that deficiencies in these first 2 configuration interfaces can cause people to go use a more complex mechanism because they couldn't do it with a simple thing, right? So if you find a place where someone's doing an override for something that should have been in config, that's low-hanging fruit to give them a much easier mechanism to actually deal with that, right? So life finds a way, right? People are going to find a way to do what they need to do if we don't provide good ways to do it. I think he's talking about frogs, right? But dinosaurs. But this is kind of what we expect, right? Is that the common things, hopefully, are things that we can solve with these kind of simpler mechanisms like configuration and interfaces, and that, it should be rare, this is kind of a future statement, right? It should be rare to need to do like just a blanket override of some part of the system or just wholesale replace something. We want simple things to be common, complex ones to be rare. And so finally, the last kind of evaluation criteria we're going to use is, if we wanted to break down the idea of ease of use, easy, hard, just a little bit more, just so that we have some more things to talk about. I came up with these four, abilities here, right? The first two up here, these are things that plugin authors are concerned about, right? Approachability is their ability to learn how to use this mechanism and then write a plugin for it. Or, sorry, plugin is the wrong word here. Extension authors. Maintainability is that once you've created that thing as someone trying to customize the platform, how easy is it for you to actually continue to keep that thing working? Oops. Keep pushing up instead of down. And the second ones here, right? This is about the actual maintainers of the platform creating an extension mechanism and then documenting how it works and being able to support that in the long term. And you expect that these bottom two actually, improvements in the bottom two should help people actually have a more approachable or maintainable experience, one hopes. So just to summarize all that, right, we have some categories, back and front end content cross service. We have some methods, configuration interfaces, plugins, overrides. It was hard to find an emoji for every single one of these, but I valiantly attempted it. Ease of use, approachability, documentability, supportability, maintainability. So we're gonna use all these in order to walk through all our mechanisms. So here we go. So we're going to do this by category, right? Because they kind of group well into these kind of configuration interfaces, plugins, override categories. So we'll start with configuration. And so this is what we're going to be looking at for the next 10 minutes or so, things that look kind of like this, right? And so how do we read this thing? The name of the mechanism is at the top, Django settings. It's category, it's a backend thing. Those little health bars there are the survey results, kind of compiled into a cute little blob, right? They kind of range from 0 to 3 as a score, and 0 means very easy, very common. 3 means very hard, very rare. The first bullet is generally just like a really, really short description of what this thing is. I'm sure people can find quibbles in those as we go along, because I had to condense what it was into one little sentence. And the second one is, this is the opinionated part, right? This is my critique of this thing, based on how it seems to be getting used, and kind of a breakdown of ease of use there. So, here's Django settings, right? So you'll see here, this is, as one might expect, the very most common thing that everyone says they need. No surprise, right? You can't run the thing unless you can actually set the URLs for where stuff goes. Surprisingly, the second one there, easy to hard, it's not as easy to use as it is common, right? It's a little more complex than that. And I think as some of us I'm sure know, the configuration, the way we actually do Django settings in the platform has grown and evolved over the years, and it's become a thing where we're trying to configure multiple services at once with one set of config. It's got multiple layers. There's a configuration repo, which is in some sort of nebulous state between people wanting to use it, not use it. edX uses some other thing. There's a lot of layers of complexity here, and so, to me that means in the supportability sense, as a maintainer, this is actually difficult to support because we actually have to contend with all these layers. Once you kind of build the thing as a consumer of it and kind of get it set up, maintaining it, I don't think change that much. They're relatively simple, so the maintainability of it is decent. Second one, the kind of companion to this, right, is micro front end settings, environment variables. These, are, I think, proportionally less common and easy based on micro front end still being relatively new for a lot of us, right? But the way you work with these is not great. You have to actually supply them on the command line. They're string only. You can't actually supply a number or a Boolean. If you try to say true, it gets turned into true. That's not great. So from an approachability standpoint, we're not in a good place here. There could be a lot of improvements to this. The runtime MFE configuration API that we actually heard about earlier today is an improvement to this, which is great. But from the documenting and supporting side of it, not so bad. There's a list. They have different definitions. just kind of trucking along here. I classified translations under configuration. This could have said translations at the top instead of configuration, yeah, but 4 categories was easier to put than 5. Relatively common, relatively easy. Tutor does a great job of making it pretty straightforward to add new translations. And so, I think we're in pretty good shape here. I've heard rumblings at the conference yesterday that we're investing here. Kyle may know more about somebody here might know more about that. Do you know more about that? That's okay. Was there a bug? Okay. Well, anyway, so I think we're even doing more investment here in order to kind of make the process of doing translations kind of more transifex based and easier. Here goes my voice. Let's get some water. So meanwhile, over in microfrontend land, oh boy. So Tutor, I double checked this with Regis. Tutor can edit translations. Is he here? No, I don't think so. Okay. It can edit translations for microfrontends, but can't add new ones because there's a hard-coded list way down deep in the bowels of the front end that prevents you from actually adding new languages. It's a bummer. I take credit for it. So from the kind of, scores, not so great, right? Like Tutor makes it relatively easy to actually kind of work with these, but you add a new one and nothing happens. That's pretty damning. So next group, interface capabilities. I've struggled for a long time to come up with a word that would kind of sum all these things up. Interface, but it's what it is. I gotta remember to drink the water. All right, so REST APIs. Interface is actually in the name, right? So these are the main issues here kind of are around kind of discoverability of all these. You can go get Swagger. Is that the word I'm looking for? Swagger's the API reference. My brain just stopped. You can go look at Swagger for edX platform, but there's not a super discoverable way of like finding out what APIs exist in all the systems. And then furthermore, like I think we have a pretty spotty way of actually versioning APIs and stuff, to make sure that like breaking changes are things that we know about. They get into the release notes if we're lucky, but I think a lot of APIs. This probably is what a lot of companies and groups do. Is they have v1 in the URL and no one ever changes it, right? So I kind of give this a low maintainability score just because like discovering what has changed on you is I think a challenge. LTI, is a standard. It's encouraging broader adoption. This is a great idea because these LTI tools exist out in the world. Like we don't, as a community, don't have to necessarily even make them. Many of them are already there. This is a good example of this in discussions, right? My personal pet peeve with LTI is that their documentation is completely impenetrable to normal humans, and I see at least one nod. And so I think we could help adoption of LTI by kind of smoothing over the process of setting up and kind of hiding some of the details. I've broken the hooks extension framework into 2 pieces: events and filters. Filters we'll see in a little bit, but hooks events. This is a great example of something that can, help us decouple extensions from the core code. Like an event gets created within edX platform, for instance, and then your plugin can just subscribe to it without knowing where it came from at all. And so we're in pretty good shape here. The only reason I give this, this kind of okay for maintainability is I think I'm happy to be wrong about this, by the way, if someone wants to correct me. I think we, like in many other places, have kind of a versioning, problem on our hands in the future as these things continue to get revved, as the event schemas change. We just need to stay on top of that. And then its companion here is the event bus, which is actually kind of a cross-service version in a way of what Hooks does within edX platform, allowing us to actually subscribe to an event in a new service that we're creating somewhere else, or in just any sort of consumer that wants to pull an event off of it and process it in some way. If someone is surprised by my redux and approachability, I think that's there because, setting this up, working with it, writing the consumer, thinking about replayability and fallbacks, retries, and all these different things in order to make sure that you're consuming these things safely is a lot of work that requires a lot of domain knowledge. But again, I think both of these we're investing in heavily right now, right? And so these are two great examples of they're pretty. I think Event Bus is maybe the hardest and like rarest of things that we surveyed for. It probably shouldn't be. It should probably be far more common and far easier to use than it is. And hooks probably suffers from the same because they're fairly new. And the last two in this kind of interface category, custom JavaScript problems, JS input. I have a feeling I didn't put the word JS input on the survey, so I have a feeling people didn't quite know what I was talking about. But this is an interface because we provide an API for doing grading with these. It's iframed, sandboxed. It's isolated from the actual platform. You can't go messing with stuff with it. But it's a bit archaic, I would say. There's Python code in a HTML file. A little weird. So kind of middling marks here. Micro front-end service implementations. I have a feeling most people don't even know what the heck this is at all. Turns out in micro front-ends, you should be able to replace the logging service or the analytics service. By default, it uses New Relic and Segment. Turns out we never quite finished the feature, another one I'll take credit for. And you can't actually change those because of the limitations in configuration for micro front-ends. So this, it broke the thermometer over there in terms of difficulty. Documentability-wise, like the APIs are actually quite simple. There's only a couple of different functions. They're great, but you just can't use them. All right. Plugins. We have a few things that we're kind of deeming plugins here. The difference between plugin and interface, in my mind, is kind of that a plugin is getting in there and can potentially modify existing functionality based on, on how it works. So I might as well just talk about XBlocks and Django app plugins kind of together, right? These are both things you're installing into edX platform or some other Django project. They both suffer from similar problems in that they're not sandboxed from the rest of the app in any way, which is powerful in some ways, but is going to get you into trouble long term, right? In that if you're using some internal API, some internal code, no one's going to tell you that changed when you go to the next release. You're going to find out because everything breaks. I think XBlocks could get some investment in terms of simplicity and kind of modernization. Django app plugins are probably in a pretty good place in that they kind of are a nice way of getting new functionality into an existing system without needing to go modify a bunch of files, add URLs and things like that. I'm losing it here. We're doing it on time. And that is till question time, right?
You have 7 minutes to talk and 15 minutes.
Oh, good. Okay, we got plenty of time. And the last one here, here's our friend Filters from Hooks, right? This is another great example of being able to, in a very approachable way, modify existing functionality of the platform by kind of providing a new pipeline step that can it's like a middleware, if anyone's familiar with that from Node. Suffers from some of the same sort of problems, right? Like this is potentially invasive. You could be, if you don't follow the contract correctly, you could break existing functionality. And you need to be careful. We need to make sure that we document these things well. Finally, our group of overrides. Oh boy, it's going away. I might have to start whispering into the mic in a minute. We'll get there. Sorry, so some of these are gonna be pretty familiar, right? Comprehensive theming. So here's a really great example. Look how common it is. It's got, I think, the second highest common score of the entire survey. It's also very hard in that you can override anything in the front end. In any part, you can override this much, you can override this much, you can override this thing over here, you could end from release to release of the platform. You have no way to know if that's going to continue to work except for just looking at Git diffs. This is not a great place to be. This is our primary way of extending and modifying and customizing the front end. That's, we've been with it for a long time. There's probably a little bit of Stockholm syndrome here or something, I think. But this is not great. We can do better, but this is, we created this system and we've been living with it for a long time. The kind of companion to that is micro front-end branding, which is more narrowly scoped to, CSS and Sass. This could also be, because it's more narrowly scoped, I think it's a little less risky. Like, you could do anything you want in a comprehensive theming and, in some Django template. So the scores are a little bit higher here. I think we can make it even better, make it even more config-like for very common use cases. I'm going to run over that a bit. Right, and then our last two here. We're at the end of this section, and we'll get back to the fun evaluation. Right, micro front-end component overrides. This is effectively forking. This is how we actually modify headers and footers of micro front-ends. There's a front-end component header repo. You make a fork of it. You modify it to how you want it to look. You change, the menu items or whatever's in the footer, and then you link it in as an override for the one that's in the micro front-end by default. It's kind of hard to use. No one quite understands how it works, especially when you start getting into how it affects node modules and stuff. But it was, at the time, the only way we could think of to actually do this thing. These scores of common and hard, I think, is probably going to need to be more common than it is as people continue to use things. And then finally, forking, right? Anything. You could take any repo that's part of the platform, fork it, link it in, and change stuff. This is, and to be clear, I know that forking is part of people's development process, of course, right? That's not the forking we're talking about. We're talking about I need to change something. I can't change it. Screw it. I'm just going to go off the beaten path here and make my own version of this thing, right? This is, look at how common it is. This is far more common than many of the other things that should ostensibly be much simpler. It's damningly common. The fact that people need to do this a lot is a problem, because like any of these other kind of override things, maintaining this is very hard. You're just going to go stare at get diffs of edX platform for days trying to figure out how to upgrade to the next release. This is keeping people from upgrading, edX platform versions. It's keeping them from getting new features. It's keeping them from staying current with everything. This is a big problem. So I didn't even think too hard about the 4 things at the bottom. I just gave them X's all the way across the board. All right, so we've gone through everything now. And so let's talk about some problem areas here. There's a bunch of different ways we can look at this. So let's take those scores, the check marks, OKs, and X's that we're talking about there. I tallied them all up. A check mark gets you 2 points, an OK gets you 1 point, and an X gets you no points. You can see here, the 50% approachability config. That means that config's approachability got a 50% overall, 4 out of 8 points. If you add all these up, this is what we get. As you would expect, overrides score pretty low. They're not great ways of doing things. Interestingly, the plugins that we have, there aren't too many data points here, but the plugins we've done a pretty good job of kind of creating, well-bounded things that are pretty easy to use. And then config and interfaces, those scores should be much higher, right? Those should be config should be 100%, interface should be 75 or more, right? This, to me, speaks to the need to invest in these areas, and we'll get to kind of more specific things we could do in a moment. This is the survey summary. These are, I took everybody's easy to hard, common to uncommon, I averaged them. These are the average scores for these things. They're a little hard to read, but everybody's there. Event bus and hooks are way over there, I think in a way because they're new. People haven't used them very much. They're yeah, that's hard. I don't know how to do that, right? You can see Django settings way over here on the common side. It's a little dense. What if we, take these and average them together by their method? So here we have config, overrides, interfaces, and plugins. These are their averages, and I put those kind of quadrants from earlier in the presentation. I kind of put them on there just so we could see them. There's some interesting surprises here, like interfaces, which should be a fairly common thing. Like using a REST API should be a fairly easy thing to do. Pretty far up, right? Overrides and plugins, far more common than I would expect. And so to me, this kind of means a few things, right? I would expect config and interfaces to be much easier and much more common than they are. I think we should endeavor to invest in them so that they move in this direction. And as a result of that, I expect, we don't want anything to get harder, obviously, but I would expect the need to use plugins and overrides by simplifying some of these other interfaces. We should see them become more rare, more, proportionally. I'm hoping I'm not this guy at this point. All right, another way to look at this, coverage, right? This is categories versus the methods. You can see there's some gaps here. So if we look over in that config column, cross-service and content, well, okay, sure, there's Nginx configs for how all our services are put together. There's config stuff for content. We're not going to worry about those too much. Overrides, cross-service overrides, and I don't even know what those mean. The content is written by the person. We don't need to override that. It doesn't make any sense. These two right here, what is this gap? Front-end plugins don't exist. Idea of a cross-service plugins may be an interesting idea. It also doesn't exist. So these are a bunch of different ways we can kind of dissect this and think about it. And so now let's get into kind of more specific actions that I think we can take. And again, this is through the word opinionated in there for a reason, right? These are the things I can think of, right? This list should be expanded, and hopefully there's a bit of a rubric in here for how we can think about these things. So going through here, right? Configuration, Django settings. We need to continue to simplify this, and I think this effort is happening, right? For micro front ends, there are PRs out there in order to make the configuration process easier and more kind of canonical and more flexible, and using other data types beside a string. Doing that also enables some of those New Relic and segment service implementation stuff I was talking about. Backend translations in a pretty good place, like we were talking about. I think we're doing some investment there. By this I meant, we have layers of code in Tutor to help people, override translations. It would be nice to kind of collapse that and just kind of have more kind of, support for doing this stuff closer to the actual services, so we don't need to actually have a whole nother layer of helper stuff. This helps Tutor get simpler. It helps things get more canonical. Helps things maybe be a little more vanilla. MFE translations, they need a lot of help, right? They need a dynamic list of languages. They also need kind of support for modifications at all. There's a lot of interfaces we talked about. A lot of this comes down to there's versioning gets mentioned a lot in here, right? But we need better, kind of more discoverable documentation for a lot of these things, right? LTI, we want to keep that kind of simple and approachable. As we start using events more in the platform, we really need to think about kind of how those events stay idiomatic and how they stay understandable, and that that when you go to look at an event, it's suitable for a particular purpose in a way, and that it's going to have the data that you need in there, and that the shape of those event schemas don't change out from underneath you. Custom JS problems, kind of rethink how grading works, maybe get rid of the Python, modernize this, and finish the service implementations feature in MFEs. Plugins, Xblocks, I think there's been some noise about kind of a simpler front-end Xblock for things that don't need to require a lot of interactivity or don't really need a server component so much. There's probably a version of Xblocks that are much simpler for people to work with and create. Import linting is a thing I believe is near and dear to Kyle's heart, which I think comes up in a lot of these things. That the idea there is to kind of help you stay honest in terms of not importing a thing way over there somewhere else in the platform that you shouldn't have had access to begin with, right? Kind of keeping you from doing things that you're going to regret later. And then hooks filters, continuing to keep these things well documented. Quick note here about front-end plugins. This is a thing that we need to start investing in. There's a gap here. Having the ability to use front-end plugins alleviates some of the need for us to do these kind of crazy overrides and to kind of completely blow away different parts of the UI in order to actually customize them. That's not a good way of doing it. Having a kind of a more plugin-based system would actually help us do less of those things. And then just kind of a funny thing to think about, a cross-service plugin. Well, we have these hooks filters, which you hook into a process that's happening inside edX platform. What if you could do that with APIs or with events? Basically, for your system, you could actually add more data that you needed for something of yours, into an event bus event or a REST API, in order to kind of make it more flexible without you needing to go write a new API or a fork or something like that. And then finally, overrides. Which time do we have left? We're going to 3? Is that what it is? Cool. All right, we're good. Finally, overrides, right? Like, we've been here with comprehensive theming for a long time, right? It is going away over time as things get, and there will be no comprehensive theming in MFEs. There will be the ability to do these component overrides, which is very similar, right? But like, we need to move past this and have kind of a more thoughtful, simpler mechanisms that are more maintainable. In the MFE branding realm, the ability to kind of, having to override parts of a SAS style sheet is okay. I think we could make this even better kind of by making it, using design tokens, making it a little more config-like. If you just want to change some colors, do you really need to go do a bunch of SAS and override a style sheet and stuff? MFE component overrides, again, this is this mechanism by which you can just destroy a package that was imported and replace it with something else. I think as we move towards modular MFEs, I think Adolfo is going to be talking about that tomorrow. Is that right? Tomorrow, and moving towards front-end plugins, I think there's going to be a much better way to deal with these things. I think that is much more maintainable. And finally, the degree to which forking is happening is a kind of a measure of how much we're in a way not doing well with these other things, right? It should be something of last resort, or if you're doing something, just truly innovative, that's okay. Like, we're not trying to get rid of it, obviously. You can't get rid of it, that doesn't make any sense. But, like, it should be, you shouldn't have to be like, oh, I guess I have to fork this thing. That shouldn't be something that happens all the time. So just a kind of a couple final, wrapping up things here, right? To sum all this up, our goals are that, configuration should be simpler. This encourages adoption of the platform itself because it makes things, the whole thing easier to work with. It will encourage more localization, more, getting the platform into other languages. Our interfaces, we've seen, they need to become more approachable, more maintainable to kind of take the pressure off of people needing to go do more extreme measures in order to do simple things. We need more options for pluggability in general, particularly in front end. And, conceptually, we should be thinking of doing an override as kind of a method of last resort. Doesn't mean it won't happen, but it should be very uncommon. The goal in general is to basically decompose and simplify mechanisms for common needs and leaving invasive mechanisms for uncommon stuff. And if you're, the only way to do something is an override, find the common things that you were trying to do there and go do them in a simpler mechanism and leave the really crazy stuff for the override. And finally, some ideas of best practices for when you're creating new capabilities, new extension points as a maintainer, right? Do what we just said, work to simplify. Think about how this thing's going to be used and how you can, do it in the simplest ways. Like, overrides are easy to support as a maintainer because you're just like, yeah, just blow it away, do whatever you want. They're a nightmare for everyone to actually maintain, but, again, if that's what we give people, that's what they're going to use. Decompose things into kind of component parts. If you think of these things like a plugin has an interface of how it interacts with everything, and the interface gets configured, like they're all kind of related, and you can kind of make sure you're using all the different methods in order to kind of create something robust. And that's about it. Thank you. My voice made it.
All right. Thank you, David. Would anybody like to test David's voice further by asking him any questions?
Hey, David, thanks for your talk. You didn't mention LTI, and I'm just curious.
It was in there somewhere.
Oh, it was in there?
I
I must have spaced out when you talked about it. How do you see LTI fitting into the long-term
Right, so
roadmap for
LTI, like
edX?
we're saying, excuse me. There's a lot of good tools out there, right? And LTI is a great way of safely including third-party stuff into your system. That you don't necessarily, you don't need to trust it completely, right? Because it's been iframed, it's been put in a safe way. So LTI is, from that perspective, is very good. I mean, the LTI X blocks exist. There's efforts in order to get LTI more usable, or we're calling it at one point LTI everywhere, right? The ability to use LTI in other places in the platform as kind of I'm gonna say the word plugin, which disagrees with how I classified it, but as kind of a mechanism to allow you to include things elsewhere, outside the course context. So yeah, I think we should be investing in that further.
You've talked about overriding components. You could approach the same thing if you want to. You could approach the same thing from the other end if you want to customize. You could, for example, build your own MFE or something, and instead of needing to work on a fork, you could reuse some parts of the MFEs that we already have. So you could basically reuse components that we make accessible for that. Yeah. And I would just was curious about your views on sharing out components more in this sense.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I mean, I actually didn't talk about Paragon, for instance, at all in here, but it's related, right? Paragon is a bunch of reusable components, which are building blocks you can use to make a customization or an extension, right? And so, we talk sometimes about atomic design, right? And that there are atoms, molecules, and organisms, right? Paragon is providing, for the most part, kind of atoms, very small building blocks, hyperlink, button, things like that. The vision for a lot of these things could also be that, there are some libraries that we have the library I believe you work on, right, is showing more complex organisms, which is the idea that an organism is a component that, is fulfilling a particular purpose in a particular area, right? And having these things available to be composed for anything, yeah, it's a very important part of it. I forgot about that.
Do you think that it's a good effort to try and make the whole platform as API driven as possible? So like anything that is the standard front ends is working with APIs so that you can build different ones if that's the way you need to develop?
It's an interesting question because it really depends on the use case and what value we can find in creating a generic standard API for things. An example of that is that many MFUs use what we call BFFs, which is backend for front end, which is an API specific for that front end because it needs some particular idiosyncratic set of data, right? And we don't want to make 10 requests to get it or something like that. So I think to the extent that we can find places to make an API that is likely to be useful for many people's needs, yes, of course, right? But that doesn't mean that we should only do that because that can sometimes result in kind of worse experiences if you have to compose 5 APIs in order to get your data to the front end or to a different system.
We have time for a couple more questions if anybody would like to.
This is not how I thought today would go. Yes, I think all the slides from the conference should be available. Yeah.
Any last questions? If not, thank you everyone for coming. Let's have one last round of applause for David and his voice.
Thank you for bearing with me. I couldn't talk this morning at all. It's gotten better.